Hello and welcome to this presentation on the importance of being, an exploration into the interplay between personal and professional identity for lesbian and gay teachers. I'm Branwen Bingle, and along with my co-researcher Rachel Bullingham, we carried out a small-scale project examining the experiences of 12 self-selecting gay and lesbian teachers working in primary and secondary schools in England. This presentation highlights the initial findings. Recent events, such as those seen in Birmingham around the delivery of the No Outsiders project, suggest homophobia impacts on the well-being of teaching staff and their pupils, regardless of sexual orientation. In the UK, we have the right under the 2010 Equality Act to be protected from discrimination. We know as a society that discrimination affects our health, our well-being, our resilience, and often our life chances. The 2017 school report by Stonewall showed that homophobic bullying and the use of anti-LGBT language in schools had decreased since 2012, but almost half of all LGBT pupils surveyed still reported being bullied for their sexual orientation. When our children tell us that things like this are happening to them, we need to listen and we need to act. Often, people look for the answer in representation, but the simple introduction of visible role models is not a cure for wider issues. Instead, we need environments that are socially and culturally inclusive. This means, in education, acknowledging the hidden curriculum, that is, the social and cultural influences that inform the way we structure our schools at all levels. Institutional insistence on compliance means it can be very difficult to challenge the contents of the hidden curriculum and the associated structural bias. As a result, when homophobia goes unchallenged or even unacknowledged within a culture of silence and disapproval, neither staff nor pupils are able to avoid the impact. Ultimately, our curricula needs to reflect a culture and a society where we can all thrive. Thus, it's important to identify the structures of the hidden curriculum linked to sexual orientation because we know that poor levels of mental health among lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are often linked to experiences of homophobic discrimination and bullying. It's worth noting that statistically, the situation is even more difficult for trans people. In light of this, we need to change the culture in our schools so our whole curriculum reflects what society should be, rather than accepting what is for many of our most vulnerable. The situation is changing. In previous studies, my co-researcher Rachel highlighted the different levels of homophobia that athletes faced over time, identified by Griffin in 1998 as hostile, conditionally tolerant, and open and inclusive. The climate in schools has similarly developed. For example, Section 28 was an explicitly anti-gay government act rushed through during a period of high homo hysteria in 1988, but was repealed in 2003 as the UK became more conditionally and legally tolerant. That said, the professional environment for lesbian and gay teachers has only been partially examined, and there is limited evidence of openness and inclusivity, particularly in the primary sector. Thus, this study sought to examine if a decline in cultural homophobia has impacted on teachers' lived experiences within UK schools. Previous research found that teachers were guarded about their private lives in professional settings, choosing silence about their sexual orientation as a coping mechanism in hostile environments. This was identified by Griffin as a category of homophobia, and in the context of schools, Fahy concluded in 2016 that LGBT teachers were actually less likely to challenge homophobic behaviour within the school environment than heterosexual peers. We wanted to know if being open about their sexuality, rather than working in a context of silence, affected teachers' experience in terms of their teaching and/or the behaviour of colleagues and pupils. As such, we called for openly lesbian and gay participants teaching in primary and secondary schools to take part in our research. From the interviews, we made 12 transcripts for analysis. Participants came from a range of settings and contexts across all compulsory phases of education and from various parts of the UK. All were asked questions about their demographic and professional backgrounds, individual perceptions of openness or being out, the working environment, relationships with colleagues, and student behaviour. For the purposes of this presentation, we have reflected on elements of the transcripts that relate to health, well-being, and resilience. Several of the slides contain relevant quotes from participants. Please pause the presentation and read and reflect on them. Health is defined by the World Health Organization as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. In order to experience full health, then, it is not enough to be conditionally tolerated. A climate of inclusion and openness is needed. In terms of overall health, most positive references were seen in responses from secondary staff. Participants from that phase were more likely to describe being open as meaning other staff and pupils were aware of their sexual orientation, and there were several references to pupils acknowledging their own sexuality in response. That said, the final comment shown here was made by a primary teacher. By taking part in the research, they came to the realization that they work in a very supportive climate where they felt fully accepted. However, it was not this way for all the participants. One of the possible difficulties for lesbian and gay teachers in the primary context is the conflation of sexual identity and sex as an activity, which, for example, seems to have fueled much of the rhetoric surrounding the No Outsiders controversy. Overwhelmingly, the more negative anecdotes focused on the revelation of sexual orientation within a culture of silence. Where positive events were recounted, they centred on being able to speak openly about home lives and families in the same way as heterosexual colleagues. For some, such as the two participants here, the initial silence was prompted by outward hostility displayed by colleagues and senior leaders. Even where there was no explicit or outward hostility, there were still accounts of muttered comments from colleagues and from pupils indicating the presence of homophobic views. Moving on, part of ensuring our health is looking after our well-being, thriving, not just surviving. In terms of well-being, where there was an overall sense of acceptance and a positive workplace culture, health and well-being went hand in hand. However, throughout the transcripts, there were a number of references to the need to protect others' well-being by not challenging their views too aggressively, or sometimes at all. In actual fact, this can place a strain on the individual as they police their language to fit in. The advice to others not to throw their sexuality in others' faces in the final statement here hints at the understanding that being too open can lead to issues, something the participant wants to protect others from. But it wasn't all negative by any means. Some talked of incidents where they or others were able to use the culture of openness to deal with emotional situations with support. And though 10 participants mentioned awareness of homophobic behaviour in the workplace, 7 also reported they didn't feel they had ever experienced it directly. All participants could identify examples of support from colleagues, with all but one also receiving support from their management. This support helped with the ability to be resilient. The ability to recover from difficulties associated with homophobia or conforming in a tolerant rather than open environment was most often seen in terms of response to language. Participants detailed incidents of homophobic language being said about or directly to them by colleagues and pupils. Some staff comments were in the form of inappropriate jokes or naive attempts to negate the lesbian and gay experience, whereas homophobic language from pupils tended to be in response to being told off or as a way of insulting their peers. Several participants indicated the confidence they had, or indeed had to have, to challenge this overt and covert homophobia with colleagues and pupils. Often, the level of confidence in doing so was linked to personal definitions of being out and how open they were about discussing themselves personally. One particular anecdote stood out, not because of direct homophobic language, but as an example of discrimination that stems from the lesbian and gay experience being dismissed by others. In this instance, there is a sense of frustration not only at having personal experience and expertise discounted, but also at not being able to help young people who would benefit from a more open culture regardless. But it wasn't all bad news. There was a repeated sense of ease and confidence in participants' sense of identity, which was recognised by others. The findings from our study do indicate that these teachers are experiencing the shift from hostility to openness and inclusivity that legislation in the UK demands. However, there is still much variation in individual settings and a pervading sense of reverse relative deprivation. For many of our participants, they still see surviving a low level of abuse as a successful outcome, rather than expecting to thrive as lesbian and gay teachers. To conclude, we know that homophobic bullying does not just affect LGBT pupils. Anyone can be victims of this kind of persecution where prejudice-based bullying happens. If we are to have a curriculum for everyone's well-being, we all need to work towards a culture of openness and inclusivity, of belonging for our current cohorts. And this means not relying on lesbian and gay teachers alone to develop the personal resilience needed to be trailblazers. While LGBT visibility is important, we must all be the adult pupils feel they can approach to talk about themselves and their lives, including their sexuality. Acceptance and inclusivity allow each of us to be ourselves, and in the words of one of our participants' mums, then we can get to know the real person. Thank you for listening. Stay safe.